Greetings and salutations, and welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, even if it's just to say hi, because it helps our algorithm, and share this video with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is an actor, director, and playwright. His full-length plays include The King's Face, The Night We Bombed Lincoln Towing, The Soothsayer, The Wal Martians, The Resurrectionists, Cheddar Heads, The Night Witches, and Obscenity, all having been performed or receiving stage readings across the US and Canada, as well as the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Young. How are you, sir? I'm well, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming on. Nice to finally meet you.
I appreciate the invite.
As this is with a lot of people that have come on so far, we've had maybe an email exchange here and there. And we finally have got to meet somewhat face-to-face in this regard. So you primarily trained as an actor and director.
Correct.
How has that helped your playwriting?
Well, I mean, you get to look at it from a perspective of an actor and a director. So as you're writing, you're saying, is this actable? Is it directable, etc.? I'm generally the first person to start cutting my own work. And I think that comes from having a directing background. The other thing, in my collection of degrees, I do have a degree in novel writing also from City University of London. So, and that also, I believe, is a contributing factor to whatever success I've had as a playwright.
Sure. So when you go through and you were saying it helps you in a way, how do you achieve that? As far as before you start editing, how do you know?
Well, I look at it, I have this ability, and I'm sure other people do, but I think it comes from directing a lot, of I'm able to step back from what I wrote or hope is conveyed and literally look at what is being said, what is happening on the stage, does it work? And I consider that a great asset. It's almost like two different personalities. You write it, and then I go into an intellectual kind of mode, if you will, about what am I seeing, what is the audience seeing, is what I desire to be there, what's really up there.
And then, so how do you cut then in that regard? What makes you decide whether or not something's working or not working? If
I'm in the middle of working with a cast, itself doesn't work in the actor's mouth. I attended a lecture of Edward Albee 1,000 years ago, and he literally said, you can have the world's greatest line, but if the actor performing it can't speak it, it doesn't matter that it's the world's greatest line. So I'm looking at how do I meld the actor and my words, etc. That's the basic process.
So will you always cut it, or will you try to rephrase it to where maybe it comes out a little easier, a little bit better?
Rephrasing is always preferable in my mind. Yeah.
So how did you get your start? What made you start wanting to write plays?
Well, the phone didn't ring for 6 months. and I had this idea for a play. Dolly the sheep had been cloned, and I was interested in the angst surrounding that, the religious and scientific angst. And I had this idea for a play, so I sat down and I started writing it. And fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to view it, I wasn't working, so I had the time to put the play together. And I started doing these things called pizza readings. I was in Chicago. I had millions of actor friends. I'd buy pizza and beer. They'd come over to the place, and then we'd sit around a table and read it. And they were smart people, and they'd talk about what worked, what didn't work. And honestly, I gutted this play 39 times. And I'm not talking about a line or here or there. Acts went, scenes went, characters came and went, and etc. Until finally I had a product that, was stage worthy, and had kind of through that process taught myself to write.
What were your biggest struggles or obstacles? What for lack of a better word, what mistakes were you making?
Well, I wanted to explain a lot. That was my first desire. Or I, if one example was good, 5 were better. And I think it's about trusting an audience, that what you're talking about is conveyed, that they do understand it, they'll follow it. And it's been a constant process for me. The less I can say, the better.
How do you achieve that? How would you explain that to somebody starting off?
Well, you know what? I can find examples in other literature or other plays, examples of my own. I read my stuff aloud. If I wrote a scene right now and I finished it, I'd walk away for a minute or two, come back, get a drink of water, and I'd read it out loud. And if it's tough to speak it, or I call it my butt meter goes off. I know time to slash and burn. And in some ways, I'm not trying to be vague or mysterious here. It's that simple. If it's not exciting you, it's not going to excite them.
Well, I find sometimes with young playwrights, the excitement comes from just finishing it, but they don't realize that they're not done. They think that just because
an older playwright too.
Well,
sometimes the excitement we're done.
Exactly. Well, no, that's fine, and I think that's the issue as well. I mean, like sometimes I don't know if I can speak for you on this. Sometimes we're perfectionists. I don't know when to stop. I'll always keep working, and I don't know if it's ever done.
Well, you know what? You can play with something forever.
Yeah.
You can keep it going, but there's also a point where, whatever the reason, generally when I write, and I've been condemned for this and other people love it, so I don't know. It works for me. I know the ending. That's almost what motivates me to write it, is the ending, the statement, or the visual, whatever it is that I want to convey. And generally, that's what launches me into writing something. So if that is conveyed, or I believe it is, and in readings, I'm a big believer in readings, hearing it out loud, and getting actors and directors' feedback on it. And if I believe we've hit that point, then I'm ready to send it out, And the way I look at it, you can perfect something in a reading, and then you're going to get a group of people together, and we've got this marvelous tool that we perfected during COVID called Zoom. I can be at a rehearsal anytime, anywhere, and you're going to hear and see the actors do it. And so you go through a refining process with a cast. And that's not to say, if it isn't published, or I withhold it from being published, that it won't be rewritten yet again with a different cast, or there's certain nuances will change, etc. Or people bring things to the table you never imagined,
So you will rewrite all the way up until night of performance, if it comes down to it, or?
You know what? I always want the actors to have a comfortability period. So, if we're in tech, I feel like it should be pretty much there.
Right, sure.
Outside of subtle things. I don't want to rewrite monologues and say, oh, memorize this tomorrow. Because the actor doesn't, yes, there's a certain excitement and energy that comes with that, but it's also erratic, and the actor doesn't necessarily trust it at that point.
So you basically, you taught yourself how to write. No, did you go through workshops or anything or anything like that? Or was just
Sure, I did workshops. As I said, I got a degree in novel writing. I know that's a different style of writing, etc. But building a scene applies to that just as much as it does a play, etc. Now you got to remember, being an actor and director, I have, as an actor, and performed in all but 5 plays of the Shakespearean canon. So.
Wow.
I've studied this literature to a heavy degree. I have done 10, 12 Greek plays. My training was in the classics. So I've constantly been immersed in great writing. So was I learning how to write at that time? I believe so. I just hadn't made the decision to put pen to paper, as it were,
Sure.
or finger to keyboard.
Sure. So one of the things I do want to discuss with you, I want to talk about the anatomy of certain things, certain aspects. You mentioned monologues. So I want to start off with that, the anatomy of a monologue, and what makes a good monologue. How and where do you start when it?
Well, to me, it begins with, it's a story within itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a story within the story. And the story has got to lead us to something that propels the rest of the story forward, or the arc of the play, if you will. And story to me is important. It always, I don't care if it's one sentence, you're trying to tell a story in that sentence, which leads to this event, to that event, to the whole arc of the play. I'm a big believer in that. And it's who is telling the story. You know, I spent a lot of time as a stand-up comedian. I lived over in England and I did comedy in clubs, you know, obviously writing my own material. I ran clubs, all of that stuff. And the longer I spent doing it, the less important the joke became to me, and who you are telling the joke became more important. And to some degree, I believe who is telling the monologue is almost as equally as important as the monologue, and what is it they want from the other person? Why are they talking? So it's always launching the story forward, or their agenda, if you will.
When is it time for a monologue? You know, in all the writing I do or try to do, I don't know if I've ever written a monologue, an actual monologue in any of the pieces that I'm working on. So when is it time for a monologue? How do you know?
To me, it's something, it has to be more expansive than a sentence. That whatever the idea being conveyed or what is being requested becomes bigger than a couple of sentences. That generally, to me, the first monologue I ever wrote, a character is about to be hanged, and he's a mass murderer, and he explains why he did what he did, and how actually he performed a public service. And wow. It's a whole different viewpoint of, no one else cared about this person, so I took care of it. You know, no one wanted them. I took care of it. You don't care about the indigent. I took care of it. You know, etc. Now, I'm not subscribing to that viewpoint, obviously.
Sure, of course, no.
And it was something that couldn't be explained in a sentence. You know.
So I'm gonna go off on a tangent on that in that regard before we go back to the anatomy stuff, because you touch on a very important thing, and I think that some people have a tendency to forget that it's not necessarily you that's speaking. That's that's the character. That's the character's perspective. Have you gotten that? Do you find that you've had people lash out because it's like they feel that that's you're saying it opposed to the character?
Well, you know what? Well, here's an example. The viewpoint of the mass murderer. I don't necessarily share that viewpoint.
Exactly, you know? And that's why I ask. Yeah. To some
degree, you know, someone once said to me that every character you write is you.
Sure.
To some degree. Have I ever expressed something like that? Perhaps. We live in a society where I might believe we don't care. You know,
right.
And I may have callously said something like that. But it's not that I necessarily agree with everything, or it's only one small part of the perspective I have of the world or that particular incident.
Sure. I just know that sometimes and not to go in a political aspect, I know that sometimes people, like nowadays, you know, in current times, they'll, you know, kind of take it out on whoever wrote, you know, the piece or anything like that. And they automatically think that, well, that's your voice. So it's obviously how you feel. So I was just curious if that was the case, you know, if you have that.
I try to avoid lecturing within it, that it reveals something about the person who is speaking. That's almost more what I'm interested in. Versus, because to me, the whole play is the statement. You know, there have been times people don't like what it says or whatever, but I haven't encountered that a lot.
Good.
I haven't encountered that a lot.
Okay.
Directing, sometimes I've had people
sure
coddle me, but yeah.
All right, so let's go back to the anatomy thing. Can we talk about the anatomy of a scene and what makes a scene? Where do you usually start? When do you know you've reached the end of that scene, and what happens next with the?
Well, I'm a university professor, so I teach playwriting also. One of the things I say is by the end of that scene, if you look at Romeo and Juliet, okay, what is the event of the scene? If you're looking at the balcony scene, most people will say, oh, they kiss. Well, they kissed at the party. That's already happened. And it isn't they've already met, etc. It isn't what is unusual and unique to that scene. And the play cannot continue unless he gets her to commit to marriage. Unless he gets a promise, she will meet at the church in order to marry. The play ends. That's the most important thing in that scene. Most of us have gotten a kiss if we're lucky on a first date. Very few of us have gotten a marriage, a commitment to marriage on the first date. You got to have a real game for that to happen. So that's what I'm looking at. That's how I know the scene's done, is that moment has happened in order to cause the next scene. And sometimes that requires me to write the next scene and go back and look at the previous scene. I don't necessarily write scenes in a linear manner either. I may get up one morning and go, hey, the ending is it's in my head and I know it, and I'll sit down and write it. But I know that eventually I'm going to have to come back and edit it, because whatever I said may be true in that moment, but not in the big picture, if that makes sense in what I'm saying. So when I get to that final first draft, I know the scene causes the next scene, which leads to the next scene, et cetera, et cetera. And we never like to say this in art, but there is cause and effect in art, right? A character does something which then sets the ball in motion, et cetera. There is a certain logic, if you will. So I'm always going back to make sure that thread of logic is there, or cause and effect, if you want to call it that. Sometimes I get going, and I don't know if I answered your question.
No, well, yes. Well, there's more to it. I'll unpack some more of that. So, what are absolute necessary things that have to be in a scene?
Well, I think it's got to draw the audience in right away. And then I'm going to go back to a basic, tenement is there's got to be conflict. I've always understood, if I'm an actor, I walk in the room, I got to start an argument somewhere. You know what I mean? That's my job, is somewhere we've got to disagree, on some level. And even if we agree, how we're going to put the plan into motion becomes contentious, or whatever it is. So there's got to be conflict that will forward the arc of the play. Internal
or external, it doesn't matter.
It can be both, ideally, psychological and physical. So when you start a scene, where do you usually start? Like, how far in? You see, now that's dependent upon the play, and that's dependent upon what's going on in that scene. What I generally find, if I got to spend a lot of time explaining to get the scene rolling, I started too early. Right. I need to jump forward into the scene, so that we're hitting the ground running almost immediately. Because you might get away with that in your opening scene. The audience expects some setup, and even then I want to get past that as quickly as I can. We're sophisticated. We're in the golden age of television. Things happen really rapidly. Audiences get it and go, and I try to emulate that in that sense. Don't spend a lot of time setting up, get in the room and have them go. That's the thrilling part, is seeing actors clash.
Are there certain rules that you abide by? Do you like your inciting incident always has to happen by a certain page, or
you know what? If I'm writing a 10-minute play, I tend to be more strict about that.
Sure.
Because you've got so little time and little space. You know, generally, I would say to some degree, I do follow that structure a bit. You know, you can break rules as long as it's compelling. You know, the rules don't mean anything until it's not working. Then I go back to the rules, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. How do you know it's not working?
I hear it in a reading. You can hear it go ka-thunk, ka-thunk, or the sentence is too long, or you write a joke, there's too many words. You can hear it. I can feel it. You know, I have this mechanism, and you'll never, you know, unless I'm on top of a mic, you'll never hear it. I grind my teeth. Ha ha. I'm not even aware I'm doing it. Okay. People have told me this. And ha ha, I know it's time to tell the next joke. I feel that in the writing. I don't write to music because the rhythm becomes too influential on the scene of whatever I'm listening to, unless that's what I want. You know, otherwise, I'm creating the rhythm for a scene. I know this guy isn't popular right now, but David Mamet, you can hear a rhythm in what he writes. It's almost musical. And even if you don't like what he's got to say, I think it's worth going back and rereading his material. There's a pull, there's a drive to it, you know, and you can feel it kick in on the page.
All right. Now we've kind of talked about a scene and what's necessary. What's the anatomy of a play? And that could be a one act or a, well, let's talk about both. Let's talk about let's go from 10 minutes to one act.
You're sort of talking about different
things.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's why I want to touch on each one of those. So 10-minute play,
well, I'm looking at maybe 3 characters in the 10-minute play because you don't have enough time to introduce a bunch of people, you know, and obviously there's no scene breaks in a 10-minute play because you don't have time for it. You know, literally. And if you need to break it, maybe it should be part of a one act or a 2 or a full length play, you know. And I'm going to keep the numbers minimal, and it's going to be on one subject, and that subject is very narrow, you know. And you got to come in running, you know, on a 10-minute play. Gary Garrison is kind of the American guru of 10-minute plays. And he wrote a book called Perfect 10. And I am telling you, read that book, follow that guideline. We all like to be creative and say we're breaking the mold, but there is a real structure to a 10-minute play, you know. And I'm going to highly recommend that book. And Gary, if you get any sales off of me, I want a commission. Okay. The one act play, to me, that goes a little bit more towards a 10-minute play because I'm going to stay on one subject, right? Now, I might have 5, 6, 7 actors, but again, I'm not going to put a lot of scene. I'm going to keep in one locale, and I'm not going to have breaks in it, you know? Again, because you've only got so much time. Now, I realize that we live in an age where what defines a one act, you know, growing up for me, it was 30 minutes, you know. Nowadays, we can call a one act a 90-minute play, you know. So you've got some variance in that. But to me, it's about staying on one topic, not trying to put a mass of people on stage and staying in one locale. And whatever the debate is or whatever the point is you want to make, everything is about feeding that. Whereas in a 2-act play, you've got time to have, you know, alternative plot lines. You can put 30 people on stage because the audience doesn't need to know everybody intimately. But even in the 10-minute play, I'm going backwards. 1-act play, 2-act play. There is a protagonist, and that story is about that one person. When I wrote my version of The Night Witches, in doing research for the play, it's about the first women to engage the enemy in aerial combat, and they were Soviet, and it was in World War II. And these women actually bombed Nazi camps and engaged the enemy in aerial, you know, flight. And there were marvelous stories, but I had to narrow it down that the heroine was one person. we were following her through the whole story, you know, and that becomes the challenge of a 2-act play, is who is going to be that person. But I even look at that, who's the hero of the 10-minute play, who's the hero of the 1-act, etc., and making it's their story, their journey. Everyone else is there to support it.
How do you write a play about aerial combat for the stage?
Well, we took different tacks with it. Okay, one was we had 2 actors holding model biplanes and swooping and zooming and coming in, you know, and lights shifting and moving around them, so that you had a sense of they're in the air, they're in the sky, you know, and they're essentially narrating what's going on. Another method that we used, it came down to one light on this actor. They had a piece of cloth that was stretched over them with a hole in the middle. They sat in a chair, and the actor just, I don't know if you could see my hands in the one, you know, manipulated the cloth. And so you felt they were moving and coming backwards and forwards. And we laid mirrors on the stage so that you could see lights popping off and like flares, you know, that bullets and tracers following them, etc. And it's just lights bouncing off a mirror, you know, so that they were looking down and seeing explosions below them and all of that. It was great fun. It's a really theatrical piece. I love it.
Yeah, it's you know? That's fascinating to hear
and
that.
What I had was a director willing to experiment, you know, because I talked about having fish line, and could we take, you know, little what do you call the little pellets you put in your stomach at a rave and your belly button, you know, they light up, little neon pellets, and if we could put them on a string and just somebody from the back of the theater hurling them down the string at the actor, you know. Now that didn't work. We couldn't figure out how to make that work, but we came up with other alternatives, you know. And that was an opportunity that was fortunate as a playwright. We could play, and we had a TD willing to experiment, you know, from day one. You know, we would turn out all the lights and try something, you know.
So this is on that note then, because this is the question I've asked, because obviously this wasn't a play that you produced, or was it? Did you produce this? Or
No. Another theater produced it. Yeah.
Okay. So at what point when you write something like this, do you say, this is my idea, this is my concept, I'm writing about it, it's out of my hands now, I don't have to worry about the logistics and the staging?
The rehearsal process for this particular play, you know, I was there. I was attending a lot of rehearsals and that. I'll stay away when they're blocking and all of that, because I don't want to be trying to be the director of the moment, you know, because you can't help yourself. You go, hey, it should be this instead of that, you know.
Sure.
But I'll stay away, and we'll talk. I generally, if someone else is directing, I will talk to them in private, you know, because I believe there should be one voice, you know, leading the thing.
100%.
Sorry, remind me the question again.
So at what point, if you write something that's so technical in that aspect, at what point do you say, this is my idea, I don't care anymore. It's not, I wrote it, you go figure it out, you know, and hope that somebody does.
See, the idea was pitched before the script was written in that particular case. You know, so I was writing to a certain group of actors, you know, I knew what the limitations were of the theater, what its budget was, etc. You know, if you're fortunate and get to do that for somebody like the Guthrie, you know, that's a different playing field, you know, who has a few more funds than most theaters, or you're on Broadway or whatever it might be.
Sure.
You know, other projects, you know, I wrote a play called Cheddar Heads, and, you know, there's those flying fish called snake heads. And there's a fishing contest. It all takes place in an ice fishing shack. And the character comes in with a garbage can full of bloody fish and holding 2 hammers. And they say, what are you doing? Well, I'm fishing, you know, so, you know, for God's sake. And that they had to figure out, you know, all that stuff. I wasn't there. For that. And I would get phone calls about, how did you imagine this? You know, Do you have, or sometimes we could go this route or we could go that route, or could we X this scene out and try something else? Hopefully you're working with people you trust who all have the play's best interest at heart.
Yeah, well, I would hope so. I guess in what it narrows down to, I'm just curious. I mean, do you recommend that playwrights just go ahead and just write it, or keep those things in mind when it comes to the possibility of maybe it being produced? Or do you think that they're taking chances of, something too complex? Or you're saying it doesn't matter, just, do whatever it takes?
I've handled it two ways. If you ask for a copy of The Night Witches, I'm very detailed about how we did it.
Okay.
And not saying they have to do that. They may come up with some brilliant way I've never considered, or be able to afford hydraulics and put a plane in the air, or whatever it might be. I'm just saying I offer an addendum that, says this is how this was done in the original production, blah, blah, blah. Other times, if I'm sending it and it's a first production and they don't really want me involved all that much, then you're crossing your fingers hoping
Sure.
they, now, having been a director, I have lots of ideas about how to pull things off. I'm not shy about saying what I like or want. There's a certain amount of risk comes with that. And I always make it clear, you don't have to stage it the way it's being suggested.
Okay. Let's go back to anatomy, and let's talk about a 3-act structure. What's the difference between a 2-act and a 3-act? Obviously, besides the extra act, but how does the structure change?
Well, I think, you've got to look at each is its own entity that builds onto the next. Because if you end Act 1 and you haven't gotten to a cliffhanger that brings them back for Act 2, then it's all sort of pointless, isn't it? You're going to laugh, I tend to use a 4-act structure. I'm influenced by Chekhov that way.
Okay.
Now, it's not that I change locales 4 times.
Sure.
But there's something to me about the way that builds. And you have a logical break point between 2 and 3. It's 4 big scenes to me versus necessarily acts, but they're generally sort of acts. The difference to me in a 3-act structure is 1 is introduction, the middle is the conflict, and the third is the denouement. And that's the way I tend to think about those. Personally, I don't tend to use a 3-act structure a lot.
So for those that are interested in a 4-act structure, how does that work?
Well, it's a similar idea. It's Chekhovian to me. Almost every play he's written has got 4 acts, and generally Act 1 will introduce everybody and the conflict, right? Act 2 will heat it up until you come to a crisis point. Then you have your intermission. Act 3, there's some big shift. They're about, if you're looking at Chekhov, generally everybody's going to go home and something prevents it, right? And then you have your Act 4 structure the Act 4 act where what they feared from Act 1 has come full circle. And I like that. To me, I think it's a neat little package.
Do you find that those are well received in present day? 4-act plays? What's that?
It's worked for me. And
Okay.
he's still produced. He's still constantly produced, People
Well,
are doing new adaptations of his work all the time.
Sure. And that's a given, but I'm just saying for Stephen Young, has it worked?
Yes.
Okay. So you do find that they're well received still. Any 4-act plays that you've written?
Well, during COVID, I wasn't produced necessarily a lot,
Sure.
but I wasn't throwing things out there because I didn't feel like my work would be best represented in terms of online productions. I have
Yes,
nothing
of course.
against that. I just,
Yeah.
I didn't want a premiere to be online.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I'm still on the fence on whether or not that really worked out as far as performances go. I saw a couple of Zoom performances, and I'm not quite sure that they really worked. I think it does take away.
Well, it's a different medium, isn't it? Because if you
Sure.
wrote a play before COVID, it wasn't designed to be done as a Zoom production.
Right.
And that's, I think, one of the downfalls of trying to cram. I can understand writing now for this forum, because I would approach things differently. I would think about it differently. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Zoom?
Right.
And let's play to the strengths of it, and write to the strengths of it. Whereas if you wrote for the stage, that's where it was intended to be,
Right. Okay. Can you teach subtext? And if you can, how do you?
That's a great. Well, here I want to spin that back on you. Can you teach writing? I believe you can teach formulas. You can teach, theory, but the person either has something to say or they don't. They have a burning desire to get it out there or they don't.
Right.
Because you can read formulaic plays and find them less than inspiring.
Sure.
It's the dynamic of the individual writing it, I believe. So what makes someone a writer?
I guess just the act of doing it is my guess. And, as long as you're sitting down and performing the act of writing.
Then it goes beyond that. Do
Sure.
people desire to produce it? Does it work on stage? Because ultimately, in terms of if I just want the word on the page, that's why I write a novel.
Right.
I'm ultimately looking, I want this produced. I want people to see and hear it, etc. So back to your question, can you teach subtext? The thing that I say about it to students and that I convey is, what do you really mean instead of what did you say? And that's what I call leaving room for the actor, that you write up to a degree that an actor is smart and talented enough to fill in what's not said, or to bring the subtext to it.
Okay.
In a nutshell.
What do you usually find are some of the beginner's mistakes for your students when they come in?
Well, they want to explain everything, right? Or they try to be funny, versus it comes out of the situation or the character, some of it is there'll be too many words in the sentence, which I guess goes back to over explaining things. But those are the common mistakes. Or they won't bring clash to something. They'll create two characters, or they'll write mood. That's a biggie. They'll create an effect that's kind of haunting and frightening, etc. But do they never tell a story out of that? They've got all the technical elements. They've imagined that. They know what they want it to look and sound like and feel like, in terms of the physical perspective, but they don't tell a story. And that's what I'm always harping on. What is the story? Go back to your story, etc. And if it doesn't fit into that funnel leading to the final statement of the story, then it doesn't fit.
What makes a good story?
You know what? I say this about directing. I've ran a few theaters early in my career, and this is what I've always said. It's got to jazz you. If I'm not compelled by it, I'm not the guy to write it. if I don't have a burning desire to direct that play, I'm not your director. And I've always said this when running a theater, we got to find plays that the actors want to act in, because if they're excited about it, then that the audience gets that. Okay. They get that. And remember, this is a basic fundamental I harp on in teaching acting, directing, and playwriting. Theater exists in that transfer of energy between the actor and the audience. That's what is unique to theater. They don't have that in film, right? It's only in theater do you have that live kinetic feed, play to act. You know, I always say you can do the musical Showboat. I know that's a dated reference, but you bring on that boat, it's exciting for 5 minutes, and then you better have something else.
Right,
know?
Sure.
Right. So what's a great story? It compels you. You want to tell it. I've written on spec before, and oftentimes I'll find something in that compels me to want to write it. But generally, the projects that I've been most successful with is I want to talk about this subject. I want to tell this story.
Outside of story being, are there other elements that you think are just as important as story?
Learn how to turn a phrase. You know, read classical theater, read the Greeks, read Chekhov, read all these great playwrights, and then you can forget them, do your own thing. But, you know, they're around because they could turn a phrase. They said things we've never forgotten in, 400,000 or 500,000 years, Go to them, find out now, this is controversial. Go to your favorite playwright, type out their manuscript, all right? Now, and then delete it. But what you're going to learn from typing it out, where do they put a comma? Where do they breathe? You're going to start to feel the rhythm of what they write. Why the sentence is only that long. Why this sentence is twice as long, blah, blah, blah. Type it out. You feel the play, you feel it. Your fingers start to become alive doing it. That's a beginning exercise, and of course, you never send that out to anyone unless you're going to make a right turn and create your own story from it.
Right. Do you when you do that, are you talking about like word for word, even character and everything, or is it just like the dialogue?
Yeah. Now, this is something I did early in my career. I don't still do it. You know what I mean?
Right.
But if you've never written anything and there's an author you admire, and because we're attracted to certain writers for certain reasons, whatever the reason might be. And, what inspired you is you want to emulate that, As an actor, I saw somebody on stage go through some sort of struggle and went, wow, I want to do that, I want to be that dude up there,
right.
et cetera. We're drawn to that. So the same is true of writing. It's about, you start to learn something about your favorite authors. You start to learn about what do they say, what do they don't say, because actually physically typing it is different than just reading it. Not that you can't learn from both. And I'm a big one on reading other plays, big believer in that. But physically typing it, O'Neill, I believe, I think he got Parkinson's, didn't he?
That I don't know.
I might be wrong about that, but I know for some reason he wrote on the page with a pen. And when he could no longer do that, his writing career was done. And it was that tactile experience for him.
Sure.
That was part of the creative process. Now, emulating his work or someone else's, that's different. But to me, there's something about the physical and cerebral connection of typing it out. I mean, I haven't done that in 20 years,
Sure.
Yeah.
How much prep do you put in before you sit down to start?
Something will strike me. Matter of fact, I'm in the mode of writing another play that's due this fall.
Congrats.
And I will start to mentally, I like to walk through museums. I like to go to concerts of music I don't traditionally listen to, because for some reason, bang, it'll launch my thoughts in a different direction. And all of a sudden, I'm receptive. And I call it the incubation period. I walk around and I'll text myself ideas. I'll have little pads of paper, cocktail napkins I write on, and eventually it'll just go, there's enough there. I'm ready to begin. And it's never the same twice. It's never the same twice. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be evasive, nor am I artsy fartsy. I get down and do the work.
No, and this is fascinating, because this is the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, because you can grab whatever book on how to write a play, and that's not really kind of tell you. The point of this is like something you might say might resonate with one other person. Like, that's brilliant. I've never thought of that. I need to try that. Maybe there's that one person who's got something sitting in a drawer they haven't touched for a while, and like, oh my God, Stephen Young said that's a great idea. I'm going to go do that. And maybe it helps. Maybe that.
Or it sat there for 10 years, and for some reason, 10 years later, on a Tuesday, you understand the play.
Exactly.
You couldn't get past it 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a legit thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't take it that way at all. So no, that's why I ask these questions,
I never sit in a movable chair, because I notice
I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing the same thing, moving back and forth, trying to make sure that I stay in frame. So would you, when you finally sit down, do you have that stack of paper and all those napkins right there?
I'll assemble them all in one place.
Okay.
And generally what I'll do is just type them randomly on a page, and then I have multiple screens, and I'll stick them up on a screen. And sometimes I'll be writing and go, hey, what was that idea on last Wednesday? Blah, blah, blah,
Okay.
And that's how I do it. So.
Are there any other writing habits that you have?
I write every day. I write something every day. Even if it's editing, I'm writing. Because when I edit, I'm rewriting.
Right.
And people are going to hate me for saying this. My students hate me for this. I don't let them use templates. I don't. Because I make them actually paginate the whole play. Because every time you change something, I reread it. It forces me to reread it, because I got to change the page. And guess what? It gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. Now, it's more laborious, and it's not that I've never used a template. Don't get me wrong. But especially in the early stages of my career, it forced me to keep rereading the thing.
Where do I want to go with this? Because it's a formatting issue, a formatting thing. So what format are you having them write in?
Well, I give them an example. It's a standard format. I give them an example of it, but you just got to type it out.
Sure.
Versus buying some software.
Right. And that's why I asked, because, and again, this has come up, and maybe the magical answer to this, because I certainly don't. And it's a beef that I've had. And, sorry for the listeners who have already heard me complain about this, is like when you submit to, like, Sam French or Dramatist, or, I don't know if the other ones are if they're sticklers about it, that it's got to be in a certain format, but yet when they print it, that's not the format that it's in. And it drives me nuts. I'm like, why are you,
it might be for ease of reading it or editing it. This has been my mantra. Anytime I enter a playwriting competition or somebody wants me to send something, if they say it's got to be in this point type and done in this manner, I do it that way. Because otherwise you're just going to the digital garbage can immediately.
Sure. Fair enough.
So I follow whatever rules they say, but at that point I've already written the play. you know.
So you'll sit down and reformat it then, if that's the case?
Generally, I'm pretty close to what most people say they want. You know, I'm not doing anything tremendously unique. Now, I've seen contemporary scripts where they put it in paragraph format, or all of a sudden there's one word and it's paginated to the right, the right side of the page, versus the left, and all of that. And it works for that playwright, and somebody's accepted it. So I don't know what the rules are anymore. I just keep doing what I've been doing.
Are there any requests that you're just like, yeah, that's not going to happen? I'm not going to do that.
You mean in terms of subject matter, or
no? In terms of submissions, when if there's I've seen these requests for theaters where they want an essay or something like that, and it's like, oh, we need you to, and it's like, just read the.
Why don't you just read my writing? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I'm not quite sure what that has to do with anything.
Well, you know what? When you encounter that, let me ask a question: are they who you want to produce your work?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
You know what? You're a good writer. Somebody's going to find you, or somebody's going to want it. There's lots of other fish.
At what point do you maybe realize that you're not a good writer? I ask because, and I don't know if you're on there, like the official Playwrights of Facebook.
I am, but I don't go on it often. I really should. I don't.
Yeah, I've kind of refrained as well. And it was usually just a lot of complaining about rejection. I'm like,
you know what I tell my students? Somebody rejects me every day of the week. Every day of the week, somebody rejects me. I mean, if you're in theater and you have a fear of rejection, you're in the wrong business.
That's true.
You're in, embrace it. It's okay. The right people are going to find you eventually, because, out of 100 rejections, all you need is one to say yes. That's all you need. And you know what? You keep going forward. You ask questions and you refine. And you refine. You keep, like you said, you keep rewriting your work. I keep rewriting. And it's eventually, I don't quit on stories. I never have. I'm fortunate in that everything I've ever done has managed to make it to the stage. I have one play that's only had a reading. That's never been produced, actually. That doesn't bother me. The right company is going to want to do it. It's theatrical. It's every time I've had a reading of it, people go, why isn't someone producing this? So and these are people who I invite, smack me in the face. Don't be nice, and I get when you're starting out, it's hard to do that. But you and I are veterans. We can hear it, and we'll go forward. And sometimes you got to go, okay, thank you, and then you go stew on it or ponder it, because you might not want that advice. But I listen because it doesn't cost me anything to listen.
Sure.
And it's developing that thick skin. And I will argue for things, especially if it's being produced. And oftentimes what I hope happens, if the director's saying this and I'm saying that, a better idea is going to emerge, or we're going to become clearer about what it is we're trying to say.
Okay. You said you write every day. Do you have a set schedule?
What I love is ideal is I get up in the morning, I eat breakfast, grab a cup of coffee, and start. What I've had to start to force to do, in the middle of COVID, I weighed 150 more pounds than I do now. Excuse me, 115. I got excited.
That's all right. It's good. It's a fair amount. It's good for you. Congrats on getting it off.
I've changed a lot of habits. One of the things I've started doing is every 50 minutes, the alarm goes off. And that means I got to get up and move around, because I'll just sit there and keep going. If I don't have to teach on a day, or I don't have a project or errands to run, or whatever it might be. So that's changed in my writing habit. I do that, but I try to sit down. I'm writing a novel. During COVID, people weren't doing a lot of plays, so we went, hey, this is the time to write a novel.
Right.
And hopefully that I'm going to have it done. Well, it's done. The final edit, I hope, is going to happen in the next few weeks, and we'll start trying to get an agent.
Congrats.
But I write every day on something.
Is there a certain amount of time, or a certain number of pages, certain number of words? How do you keep?
Now, if I can hit 1,000 words that are good, on a novel, I consider that a good day, or a couple of thousand, let's say that. I don't set those kind of arbitrary limits. You know what I mean? I go to bed generally thinking about, I need to address this or solve this, or why does the character end up where they do, blah, blah, blah. And in the morning, generally I'll wake up and there's a solution there, or inspiration of some sort is there, and sometimes it's just minute stuff.
Do you ever worry that, like, when you think about those things at night and go sleep on it, and then the next day it's like, oh gosh darn it, I lost it?
That's why I keep a pad of paper and my phone by the bed.
Okay.
I don't sleep well. Really, I'm going to wake up and take some notes or whatever. There's something to me about going into the unconscious or that realm of sleep with a question, and not worrying about if the question's answered or not. Because if it's not answered, I'll do something else. I weirdly, yes, I struggle sometimes. I can spend an hour trying to choose a word,
Oh.
I can spend hours and go nowhere, but I've never considered that I've had writer's block.
Interesting.
I'm always able to churn something out. Now, it might all be scrapped the next day, but something's coming forth that's leading to something else.
Yeah, a trick that a screenwriting friend, and I think this applies to playwriting as well, is he taught me, because I would sit there in the same way. I will spend 30 minutes on a name, and it just got to the point where it's just
Names
like,
are important.
Yeah, where I just finally, he's like, use brackets. I'm like, what, brackets? He's like, yeah, just use brackets. Say, like, whatever it is, insert clever name here. Come back to it later.
I've done that myself.
Yeah, and I found it very, very helpful until it got to the stage reading, the table read of it, to where it's just like they get to there, and then the people are like, insert clever name here, and I'm like, no, you don't have to read that. You don't have to read that. Do you have any bad habits? Do you have any bad writing habits? Or what?
I probably have some. I don't dwell on it. Dwell on them. I'll cut something that I consider clever or funny. I will hold on to that till the last possible minute. I will, and you know what? And I'll know long before I let it go, it needs to go. But I will keep holding on in the hope that somehow it's going to make the final cut. But what I do then is look for avenues somewhere else that I can insert it,
yeah, and that was going to be my next question. Do you save it for another piece, somewhere?
I keep something I call a dump file.
Okay.
If I cut something, I'll put it on that page, and somewhere I might go back. Hey, what did that person say at that and, go back and pull it up.
Are there any things that you do for every play, or maybe let's call it an Easter egg? Is there something that you'll use in every single piece?
There will be comic, no matter how dark the play is, there's always comic moments. I always insert comedy somewhere. Always do. And sometimes what's comic is what's funny to the person, not that it's a joke, or the situation is absurd. Can
you expand on that? Give an example, maybe, or?
I could watch somebody fall on a banana peel and find that hilarious, but the person who fell probably doesn't.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you know? So that's perspective. That's funny to me. I have a very, I can have a very dark sense of humor. I'm trying to think of an example that isn't offensive.
Offend away.
uh, you know, oh God, what was the line? Okay, we've had the recent shooting in Texas, and those kids went out with a bang.
Right. Oh, right. Sure.
Yeah, that's dark, not funny. I would go, no, but that's an example of something. But that's a perspective, someone of humor, etc.
Right.
That's funny to an individual versus a collective. And it's not necessarily, well, that was deliberately a joke, but sometimes, Richard Pryor had this story about working in Youngstown, Ohio for the mob at some club, and they invited him to the table and they started telling war stories, and this guy's talking about killing this guy with an ice pick, and the pick breaks off in the guy's neck. And he's laughing about, I said, Johnny Scuzio, what do I do? And Richard Pryor's, is that so? To him, it was greatly hilarious. And the story isn't really a joke, although that character found the situation humorous. So that's an example of what I was talking about.
Sure. Can you teach comedy in playwriting? Is that something you can teach, or?
I could teach you again the structure of a joke. I can show you sitcoms where you see how on Seinfeld, how this character George explodes at anything, and it becomes funny. His reaction to it is funny versus it purely being a joke, and that's something that's character driven. I can show examples, but I tend to find the students who are funny writers are funny people from the get-go. I've never attempted, I let them decide what they're going to write about, and what genre they're going to write in terms of drama or comedy. I always recommend that, the great plays all tread both lines of the road, or both sides of the road, that there's comic and dramatic elements. Even in a farcical comedy, we have to care about the people. We have to ultimately be rooting for them.
How do you teach conflict?
I do basic things. I start out with, I say, okay, we got two people on stage. You're watching television. You both agreed to watch this show. Go. And you both like it. Go. What will inevitably happen is they'll start out in harmony, and eventually they'll start to disagree the longer I let the improvisation go about an actor or a character in it or a line or is the situation. And that's where I say, when did it start to pull you in as an audience? When the conflict emerged is generally, and so they get it on a cerebral level, and I'm hoping somewhat viscerally. You gotta have conflict, the minute in some ways it's this simple. I walk on stage, I got to start an argument, whether it's a tiny argument or a huge argument, and the given circumstances of a play dictate that as an actor. As a writer, you're creating those. How passionate is any one character about the argument? And it has to vary, etc.
Do you use improv in your playwriting class?
Not a lot, because what I teach is a hybrid class. And so in the first couple meetings that are face-to-face, the rest is online. They write, generally I'll give them things like, here's how you do this, or da-da-da. Go write your scenes, After we get past the first couple of meetings, then we're reading their scenes. They have scene work due every time. And when you got 22 kids, you got to plow through that in order to get to hear everything aloud and to give feedback, in a class setting. So not as much as I like. I think in the early stages, it might be invaluable to them. I encourage them, hey, if you've got two actor friends, buy them lunch and say, hey, here's a scenario. Play it out for me. You know, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you take the dialogue, maybe you don't, or maybe it leads you to something else. Whatever is going to shake the gray matter, what might work for you might not work for me, etc. But if it works for you, then it works. You know, I got to do an opening once for Al Franken when he was a comedian, and we were at a university. He was asked the question, is off-color humor funny? And he said, if it gets a laugh, it's funny. You know, that's simple. That's simple. So if it works for you, then it works.
Where do you find your opportunities?
Do you mean to get produced or to
yes
write? Or lately it's been a little dry.
Sure. Well,
and all of that, but I am not shy about using social media if I have a production going, and you'd be surprised. I'll get a couple of hits during the run that'll say, hey, would you send me the script? You know, and I am in the search for a new person. Jay, who was the mutual friend we both knew, who recently passed. He was a one lovely man. He used to send out my material, and we'd talk about strategies. These kind of theaters do this. I think this is a great play for these 10 theaters. And we would target them, and he would, you know, I belong to the Playwright Center and other groups that, you know, list opportunities for playwrights. And he would do some research on those sites and send, you know, we were committed to getting out, you know, at least 5 scripts a month, if not more, you know, but a minimum 5. And that included support materials, all of that stuff. Where was I going? So we would find opportunities through that. There would be just, I've never been shy about if I meet a director going, hey, I have a play you might like, you know, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times they'll say no or no thank you, or give you an email missing a digit, or, you know,
sure,
whatever it might be. But you've got to be putting yourself out there, you know. And again, it goes back to thick skin. The lovely part of having Jay early in my career was he got all the rejections, you know. I didn't see them. You know, as far as I knew, everyone loved my plays. You know?
I enjoyed everything that I've gotten of yours. I've enjoyed.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a resource out there that you think every playwright should know about?
I think the Playwright Center's list is great. You know, there's the National Play. I'm going to say it wrong. NPX or
new Play Exchange.
You know what? If it gets you into a forum that directors and schools, etc., are seeing you, then do it. You know, I mean, if you got to spend $600, maybe you want to think about that. But you know, if it's $10 to join, do it. Do it. Even if it just leads to one production, it's worth it. You know, and if you don't put yourself out there, you know the answer. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just going to sit on your laptop, and it doesn't do anybody any good there.
Do you, or would you pay for submissions to submit a play?
I've tended to shy away from that. You know, I've done it with the O'Neills, you know, because I believe it's a legit organization, and you know, if it pays off, the opportunities or the payoff is huge if you get selected, you know, and who you will meet could change your life, you know. So those are my 2 big recs.
Okay.
Chicago Dramatists is also a group I believe in respect. I believe in and respect highly, you know. And again, they're not in the business of gouging playwrights either.
Sure. What about festivals that you'll get a production, but there's no compensation outside of that? What's your take on that?
Well, when I was starting out, they're going to produce it. Heck yeah.
Okay.
You let them, but also, you can call me an idiot. I was sending the community theaters and to Broadway houses at the same time. I never shied from, oh, I'm not ready for that. Hey,
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So early in my career now, if I'm going to do that, I gotta know it's a good theater, that they do good work. If I'm gonna let them have a premiere, without compensation.
What advice do you give to your students? What's the best piece of advice you could give to your students or anybody starting out?
Well, I write every day, rewrite every day, and submit. If you don't submit, you don't get produced. You got to do it, honestly, because no matter how brilliant you are, if you're not sending it out, you got your answer. You will be a starving artist.
Yeah. No way
I know
around that one.
it sounds very simplistic, but I tend to like direct, simple things. I choose textbooks on the clarity of the explanations, quite honestly, because everything else in the business is somewhat mystical. Honestly, when you go to a play, what are you purchasing? Air, an experience.
Right.
There isn't even a program to take home anymore. Unless you're on Broadway, but otherwise, a lot of theaters, they're digital. You don't even have that pulp in your hand anymore.
Oh, I don't think I could do that.
Sorry?
I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could not supply a program. It would drive me nuts.
It's becoming the wave,
Yeah, I wouldn't even. It's beyond fathomable for me.
Right.
Maybe I'm a dinosaur in that way, or just a traditionalist.
Well, I like a good program myself because I like being able to go back to it, and to me, it's evidence.
Depending on who's performing, I might. Nobody's going to sign my phone.
Right. Well, and the other thing that I have with the digital thing is how many people actually read it or bother to go to it. So
right.
All of the artists go unnoticed. Unless you're someone famous, no one bothers.
Ouch. That kind of hurts the ego a little bit. What is the biggest piece of advice you've ever been given that you apply or try to apply?
I'm going to say, if you choose a character, I think it helps. Not that you got to stay with it, but I think it helps to base it on somebody, even if it's a period piece. If I know a mechanic and this person works on planes and they're a brilliant mechanic, I'm going to bring some of the characteristics of that person because they're real, they're tangible. I don't have to make that up. You know what I'm saying? And it's not that I'm committed that the entire characterization has to be based on my mechanic neighbor or whatever it might be, but it helps launch me. The other thing is you don't always know what you wrote. You may think you've written something. You may think that statement's clear as a bell, but the first play I ever had produced, there was an Irish dance in the middle of it, and we brought in a person to choreograph it, and she had a degree in drama therapy. I didn't know her very well. She asked me if she could take me to lunch. She started talking about how much she liked the play, and I thought, well, she's a genius, etc. Obviously, you have good taste, and then she started talking about my stepfather without even knowing I had one, and who this character was in it, and she was so accurate. I had to go, stop. You got to stop. You're scaring me. you know, and you don't always know what you put on that page. You don't always know.
It's interesting.
I don't know if that's helpful. I just coincidence.
No, yeah, no. I think that there's something to say to that. You know, it's like I remember I was directing a friend's piece, and one of the actresses kept going to her. It's like, what does this mean? Why does this happen? What's the, and April was just like, go talk to James. I trust him. He knows what he's doing. Cause again, she didn't have the answers to that. It wasn't, I don't know if sometimes there's not some deeper meaning behind something. And how layered do you go in your work?
If I direct my work, I have to be careful of not trying to put 18 layers on a line.
No, I mean, when you write, how layered do you go? Is everything so on point that there's a reason behind every single thing, and this correlates to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I know that's a simplistic answer, but to me, it all connects. I go back to that idea of the line of logic. It all connects. Otherwise, I get rid of it, because it's in the way.
Right.
It bogs it down. What I'm hoping is that whatever I want conveyed resonates without me having to directly say it. That's sort of what I'm working toward. Tragedy or drama, for me, tends to lend itself to that more than comedy.
Okay. Where can people find your work?
Contact me. If they want to contact you, James, and feel free to share my information.
Okay. All right. And so is that the best way is via email, or are you on
Sure. I'm on Facebook. I'm Stephen Young. You'll recognize the hair. I will be at the Nashville Shakespeare Festival this summer playing King Cymbeline and Cymbeline. If you happen to be in that area, come on out and introduce yourself. Love to
Congrats.
meet you. Do my plays.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, Stephen, thanks for coming on to the Playwright Spotlight. Really appreciate you taking the time.
James, I'm thrilled you asked me, and I'm glad to met a future or a fellow admirer of Jay.
Yeah, he's a good guy. So, this episode is definitely dedicated to that gentleman. So, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. And also leave any questions that you may have for future playwrights that you might want on. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, until we see each other again, keep writing.